Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Zaxxon, a third-person arcade vertically scrolling space combat title, originally developed by Sega in 1981 as an axonometric title for arcades before being ported to a huge number of systems over the years, including the Commodore 64, Apple II, IBM PC, Intellivision home console, and, most pertinent to our discussion today, the Atari 2600 in 1983, with Coleco handling the development duties for that particular port. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into the history behind Zaxxon, I figured it's probably a good idea to talk about why I decided to play Zaxxon for this episode. And actually, the real reason is because it's a sponsored episode. This one was sponsored by Sean. Unfortunately, Sean was unable to get a sponsor message in for today's episode. Regardless, as always, Sean, thank you for your sponsorship and your support. Beyond Sean sponsoring Zaxxon for this episode, I do want to talk a little bit about a personal perspective on not just Zaxxon, but just on the Atari library in general. I've mentioned before that I have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to the Atari console library, in particular the Atari 2600, because when I was young, I was born in 1981. And when I was younger, the Atari 2600 had already been out. It had already been a big deal. By the time I was able to really play video games, the Atari 2600 was kind of on its way out. It was also right around the time that the video game market crash in North America, at least in the 1983 timeframe, that had happened. I was 2 years old when that happened. So maybe I was playing around a little bit in arcades, but not really knowing what the heck to do. But the Atari 2600, it kind of passed me by because I just wasn't into video games at that point. And by the time that we talked about getting an Atari 2600 or an Atari home system, that was right around the time that the NES was starting to come out in the home in North America. And as I've told you many times before, I am and was a Nintendo fanboy. I mean, I play all sorts of stuff now, but back in the 80s, Nintendo was my jam. That is exactly what I had been focusing on. That was the home console that we had as a family. It was the NES. So everything we did from a home video gaming perspective was the NES. That being said, as I've continued to learn more about video game history and as I've continued to do this podcast and just expand my overall scope of what I understand about video games, I have been trying to address the blind spot that I have with the Atari library. I have played several different Atari games over the course of the last few years for the podcast. We have a couple more Atari games that are going to be coming up this year as well. So I am trying to continue to expose myself to more Atari 2600 kind of titles, and by extension, other Atari titles that might not be on the 2600. Think about systems like the Lynx or the Jaguar. I want to tackle some of those games because I'm curious, and I'm a curious guy, and I enjoy looking at all sorts of things, especially things that I have not looked at before. The thing with the Atari 2600, though, that makes it a little bit of a tougher pill to swallow, so to speak, is the fact that the Atari 2600 is fairly limited in terms of overall horsepower. Its hardware and software, while awesome for the time that it was created, when you look back at it now, ooh, it's a little rough sometimes. I mean, you don't have nearly the level of quality from a graphical perspective or an audio perspective as what you would get with even the 8-bit consoles of the time, like the NES or the Sega Master System. I mean, they were light years beyond the Atari 2600 from a graphical and audio capability perspective. Even gameplay, you look at the Atari 2600, gameplay was relatively limited. You had a joystick and a button, and that was pretty much it. You didn't have 2 buttons like what you would have on an NES gamepad. It's just, there's a lot of limitations there. So for somebody going back to look at these kind of systems, the older kind of systems like the Atari 2600, without any particular true nostalgia for it, can sometimes be a little bit of a tricky thing to get over. I mean, you have some instances where geometric objects like squares or circles were used in place of real characters because the 2600 couldn't really render pixel art, or I'll say sprite-based art, with any degree of fidelity. Now, there were, of course, some games that did do that, and there's games that we've looked at that have created pixel sprite-based kind of artwork that does resemble more of the kind of stuff you would expect to see and not just geometric shapes. But the fact is, the Atari 2600 is very, very limited. That being said, I absolutely want to continue to dive into that hardware and that console ecosystem. And interestingly, one of the things that interests me most about the Atari 2600 is the fact that it came out right around the time of the heyday of the, how would I classify it? I don't know if I'd classify it as the golden age of arcades, because for me, the golden age of arcades was later in the 80s into the early 90s. But I guess the vintage period of arcades, of video game arcades, where they were kind of making their way across the globe. There were so many high quality titles coming out that would set the stage for the rest of the video game industry that would follow. There were so many of these arcade games. And back then, arcades were much more powerful than their home console counterparts. And the thing with that is that it didn't matter that the arcades were so much more powerful than, say, an Atari 2600. If you had a popular game in the arcades, you could almost guarantee that game was going to be ported in some way to home consoles and computer platforms. That's exactly what happened with Zaxxon. Zaxxon was originally released on the arcades, or in the arcades, as an axonometric projection, and I will explain exactly what axonometric projection is, but it was released as an axonometric projection title. When it made its way to the home, not every home console, computer, platform, whatever, not everything could actually run a title using axonometric projection. So when that game was ported to different video game consoles, and most prominently for today's discussion, the Atari 2600, the thing is, it went away. Axonometric projection, no longer a thing. The actual reason why Zaxxon is called Zaxxon failed to exist in the Atari 2600 version, and we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But as I looked at Zaxxon for today's episode, I noticed that even though it's not using axonometric projection for its graphics, it still kind of presents an early 3-dimensional flight combat experience, and I was super curious. I didn't realize something like this, and granted it is kind of rudimentary, but I didn't realize that there was this pseudo 3D representation of a flight combat game for the Atari 2600. So as I sat down to begin playing the game, I had to know, how the heck could this be possible on a system with such limited hardware horsepower? That is exactly the question that we're going to attempt to answer as we continue our discussion. Zaxxon's arcade iteration was an axonometric projection flight combat shooter developed by Sega for arcades in 1981 before being ported to a number of different consoles and home platforms over the years, including the focus of our discussion today, the Atari 2600 in 1983, which was developed by video game company Coleco. Before we can talk about Zaxxon, we need to take a look back at the arcade gaming scene of the late 70s and early 80s, which was a period of time with tons of innovation coming to video games across arcades around the world. There were a number of new genres and gaming types that made their way to the scene during this era of gaming, with one style of game being something we actually just talked about a little bit a couple of episodes ago, that being the side-scrolling shooter. Like we talked about during our episode on Contra 4, the side-scrolling shooter was revolutionized by the game Defender, which was a 1980 title by Williams, which introduced a continuous scrolling world rather than a static screen, and this was a big deal. Many arcade games around the time used single screens for almost all of their gameplay, which meant you move to the side of the screen, nothing happens. It's not like you scroll to the left or scroll to the right or scroll up or scroll down. Sometimes you would transition from one screen to the next, but for the most part, a lot of arcade games were single screen kinds of experiences. Defender changed all that. Defender introduced a continuous world where when you moved to the right-hand side of the world scrolled with you. Players would control a spaceship, moving in all directions to rescue humans and defeat aliens as they played through the game. Defender was a massive departure from the games that had come before it, and as is oftentimes the case with innovative titles, it would go on to inspire many future games that would enhance and evolve on that brand new formula. One of which was the game Scramble by Konami in 1981. This was another arcade title, and it really built upon the Defender framework. It introduced not just a world that would scroll with the player as they moved left or right on the screen, but it introduced the concept of a constantly scrolling world, meaning the world was going to move whether you moved with it or not. You controlled where you moved within the confines of the screen that was showing on the screen at the time, or within the graphics and the gameplay world that was showing on the screen at the time. But beyond that, the world moved and you had to react. You had to avoid obstacles. You had to defeat enemies. This was one of the first games with mission-driven gameplay. It wasn't just about getting a high score. You were on a mission and you went through multiple levels in order to achieve that mission. You would avoid the obstacles, you would defeat the enemies, you would try to save the day, and then in arcade fashion, you would try to do it all over again for the next run through the game. Scramble would be Konami's first global arcade hit, and even more so than Defender, would be a title that would make companies stand up and take notice. This was very different than any title that had come before it, and a true harbinger of things to come. And one of those companies that thought Scramble was really good, and also wanted to iterate on that formula with their own ideas, was none other than the arcade giant and eventual home console juggernaut, Sega. Sega was no stranger to arcade game development. It began making electromechanical games back in the 1960s, with perhaps their most influential title of the time being 1966's Periscope, which was an electromechanical game that effectively used a series of physical switches and lights, and some sort of projection kind of light behind a film screen kind of view. It wasn't a monitor. It was not a video monitor. It was more of almost like a piece of fabric that you would see lights shining up behind. It was truly not a digital kind of game. But it would be a big deal. Periscope would set the world on fire and be one of those early arcade games that people literally looked at and thought, wow, this is amazing. Even beyond creating Periscope back in 1966, though, Sega would evolve over the years to eventually become a full-fledged arcade game developer and publisher, both from an electromechanical perspective as well as from a digital arcade standpoint. And actually, beginning in 1973, that's exactly when Sega would branch into digital arcade development, with its first focus being on early sports titles like Hockey V and Goal Kick, before eventually expanding into other genres, most prominently action and shoot-'em-up titles, many of which were often light gun games, which we actually talked about fairly in depth during our Operation Wolf episode. We talked all about the technology behind light guns, how they work, why they were made in the first place. We talk all about that in our Operation Wolf episode. So if anybody's interested in learning more about light guns as a technology and the history of light gun in gaming, definitely check that episode out. Anyway, in the early 70s, this was still a period of time when arcade game development was rapidly expanding, and technology was enabling new and innovative features almost every day. And Sega, for its part, would establish itself as a major player in the arcade space, both from a development perspective as well as from a publishing standpoint. This joint role of publishing and developing various titles was baked into Sega's DNA from the very start of its video game development lifetime. I mean, even the venerable Periscope, which many people assume was solely created by Sega, was in fact a joint effort between Sega and the company that would eventually come to be known as Namco. And later, Sega would even publish the Nintendo-developed electromechanical title Wild Gunman in 1976. Now, of course, this predates the Nintendo versus Sega console wars that would emerge later on, but still, it is interesting that these two eventual competitors would in fact have some degree of cooperation in the 1970s. Anyway, As Sega began developing more digital arcade games and continued to expand across the arcade market, they knew that they needed to work smarter, not harder, which is why they began increasing the number of publishing deals as the 70s went on, content to work with other talented companies to develop a good chunk of the games that would be released as quote-unquote Sega titles. Sometimes those efforts would be a true developer-publisher kind of relationship, but other times they would be more collaborative in nature, where Sega would come up with the design and ideas for a given game, and then subcontract the work out to a different studio to develop that concept into reality. Interestingly, this is exactly what would happen in 1981, as Sega, after seeing Konami's Scramble, knew they wanted to create their own version of a side-scrolling space shooter kind of experience. But they didn't want to be thought of as derivative of Konami's 1981 hit. They wanted to innovate on that formula. At the same time, they didn't necessarily have all of the resources in-house to handle the development of that title themselves, which is why, to create Sega's response to Konami's Scramble, they decided to hire Japanese electronics company Ikegami Tsushinki to develop the actual game, with Sega providing the direction and the design needed to bring that title to life. Ikegami Tsushinki was founded in 1948 as one of Japan's most influential and successful manufacturers of professional and broadcast television equipment, like video cameras and the various peripherals and components that would make up that equipment. For over 30 years after its founding, the company was focused solely on innovating in the broadcast equipment space. But interestingly, as the late 70s progressed, the company decided to begin diversifying their product offerings, and figured, why couldn't they begin developing video games alongside the more mechanical equipment they had been focused on up to that point? Well, it turns out that that concept would soon become reality. Though interestingly, Ikegami Tsushinki, despite boasting a level of video game development talent that would rival nearly any other development studio at the time, would never become a major player in the video game development scene. Or at least, they wouldn't become a widely known player in that video game development scene. Here's the thing, and here's the way that that company would often work. When Sega reached out and said, hey, we need you to develop this brand new game that we have a design for and we have an idea for, they did not want anybody, really. Well, I take that back. They didn't really want it prominently known that Ikegami Tsushinki would actually be the developer for that game. They wanted this game to be a Sega kind of game, almost to have the company work in the shadows, to subcontract with them so they'd certainly get paid, they'd certainly be recognized as being the developer behind the title. But if you're going to look at the title screen, you're not going to see an Ikegami Tsushinki logo anywhere. You're going to see a very prominent Sega logo. And that's something that actually wasn't all that unheard of, especially with Ikegami Tsushinki, because if you look back in their history, they actually had a very similar kind of relationship with Nintendo and Nintendo's entrance into the arcade scene in the 1970s. They didn't have the ability or the clout to really market themselves as an independent game development studio. Nintendo certainly did, but the thing with Nintendo was that back in the 70s when they entered the arcade market, they didn't have an internal development team, which meant most of Nintendo's earlier arcade games and even their successes may have been designed or conceptualized by Nintendo staff, but were actually developed by other companies. Think about titles like Sheriff and Space Fever. Those are two early Nintendo arcade games. They were not developed by Nintendo. They were created by Ikegami Tsushinki, and you would really have no way of knowing that by looking at the game itself. Oftentimes, if you looked at the actual assembled source code for the games, you might see something in there that references Ikegami Tsushinki, but other than that, you're not going to see their logo on a screen. And interestingly, that relationship would lead to one of Nintendo's biggest blunders, as well as one of its biggest successes. We have talked several times before about Nintendo's 1980 title Radar Scope, where they created this game that they thought was going to be a huge hit. They created it in Japan, they got a lot of great feedback in Japan, it was really big, and they expected that title to be a big hit when it released in North America. Unfortunately, shipping logistics and delays made it so that Radar Scope never had that big of a release in North America. A number of those arcade cabinets that got shipped over to North America by the time it got here, around 3/4 or 3,000 arcade cabinets were literally left sitting in warehouses because by the time the game would come out in North America, The actual focus and the desire to play that game, it had waned. The popularity had waned. Radar Scope looked like it was going to be a gigantic issue for Nintendo, primarily from a financial perspective, but also potentially from a reputation standpoint as well, because Nintendo was trying to rapidly expand its video game footprint. They wanted to expand in the arcade space. They wanted to be known as a video game development studio almost without equal. Well, it's hard to do that when you don't release hit after hit of games. Now, Radar Scope. I have often said that Nintendo created Radar Scope, and that is true. But it is also true that the reason Radar Scope exists in the first place is the fact that Ikegami Tsushinki created the actual code that ran the game. Radar Scope is another one of those titles that was developed from a concept and design perspective inside Nintendo and by Nintendo staff, but Ikegami Tsushinki was the company that brought that game to life. And even more interesting, when Nintendo put out a call to the entire company to say, how can we repurpose all of these sitting Radar Scope cabinets that are not being used in North America? And when Shigeru Miyamoto came forward and put forward the idea for the creation behind Donkey Kong, which would become Nintendo's biggest hit up to that point, and would even beyond that be one of the biggest hits in arcade and video game history. When all that happened, and when Miyamoto had his design approved for this character, Jumpman, that would jump over barrels and eventually defeat a big bad ape and save a damsel in distress, that design was purely Shigeru Miyamoto. The development behind Donkey Kong wasn't Nintendo's at all. They had subcontracted with Ikegami Tsushinki, and they were the company, or that was the company that actually developed, and by developed I mean wrote the actual code that created Donkey Kong. I am not meaning to take away at all from the creative prowess of Miyamoto, because I truly believe he is a legend in video game design, and Nintendo is a legendary video game company, and Miyamoto was truly the force behind Donkey Kong's creation. But the simple fact is, without Ikegami Tsushinki, it's unclear if Nintendo itself could have developed a game with the same level of quality. They just didn't have that development talent on staff at that point in time. Now, I don't want to belabor this point, but as you might imagine, when you have companies that work together and one company is kind of being told to stay off in the shadows, you could potentially have some conflicts that arise. And that is exactly what would happen between Ikegami Tsushinki and Nintendo. There was a legal dispute between the two companies that would persist throughout the entire 1980s. And the reason for that legal dispute has to do specifically about the source code for Donkey Kong. When Nintendo had originally contracted for Donkey Kong to be created, Ikegami Tsushinki had created all of the code, and they were the owners of that intellectual property. Nintendo, as you would expect some company to do with a really big worldwide hit, wanted to continue to profit from that original hit. So they decided we're going to make more Donkey Kong games, and specifically they wanted to create Donkey Kong Jr. in 1983. Now, around the time 1983 is happening, so around that time period, Nintendo does at this point have a bit of an internal development staff. They have people that they're working with from within Nintendo itself to create some of these titles. So, when the time Donkey Kong Jr. was being created, or by the time Donkey Kong Jr. was being created, Nintendo had people that they could rely on that were part of Nintendo to create Donkey Kong Jr., which sounds great. The thing is, they didn't have the original source code for Donkey Kong, and they wanted to take advantage of all of the great gameplay features and designs that went into that original game. And specifically, they wanted to use, or at least be able to leverage, some of the programming prowess that enabled Donkey Kong to run in the first place. So the question becomes, well, how do you create a sequel for a game that you don't have the actual code for? Well, if you're Nintendo in 1983, you partially reverse engineer it, and partially copy the source code from the programmed assembly language that existed in the memory chips of the original Donkey Kong arcade machine. But there is only one issue with that. Like I mentioned, Ikegami Tsushinki's name was nowhere to be found in Donkey Kong the game. You couldn't go to some screen and see their logo. But the company did embed its little bit of a logo, copyright kind of symbol-ish kind of thing. It was embedded in the game's assembly code. And assembly code, for anybody who may not be aware, is not natural language, meaning you're not going to type out assembly code and you're not going to see English. It's all code that will be understandable by a computer, but as far as actually looking at it and saying, oh yeah, that reads XYZ, no, it's all about registry manipulations and memory movements and pointer logics and all that kind of stuff. Assembly code is not easy to read. So when Nintendo copied the assembly code from Donkey Kong into Donkey Kong Jr., they had no way of knowing, without really going a lot deeper than what they did, that they actually copied the name Ikegami Tsushinki into the source code for Donkey Kong Jr. Even though this was a still developing area of video game copyright law in the 1980s, it was still viewed as a big no-no. Now, the two companies would eventually settle out of court in 1990 for an undisclosed sum and payment, but not before the Tokyo High Court recognized that Nintendo had effectively committed copyright infringement. Tangent aside, Ikegami Tsushinki had proven itself to be a talented development studio, despite only beginning to develop video games in the early 80s. So, when Sega began searching for a company to work in the shadows, so to speak, to develop their answer to Konami's Scramble, they knew just the company to call. So Sega met with Ikegami Tsushinki, and they needed to discuss how to distinguish their forthcoming side-scrolling shooter from the competition. And here, Sega had a brilliant idea that had incidentally never been seen before in a video game. Rather than create a simple two-dimensional plane for this forthcoming title, they thought, wouldn't it be cool if the game could be a sort of 3D representation of a space combat experience? It might be tough to develop this kind of game, especially in the early 80s, but if any company was up for the challenge, it was Ikegami Tsushinki, who agreed to the concept and began creating the game that would eventually come to be known as Zaxxon. Before we continue, we need to get a little bit technical for a second and talk about the way Zaxxon would be turned into a pseudo 3D video game before anyone even knew what the heck 3D in gaming could actually become. The answer to that mystery lies in mathematics and the concept of axonometric projection. Axonometric projection is a term that you may not have really heard of before, but I bet you've heard of one of its styles of projection, which is isometric projection. It turns out that isometric, which is a commonly used term for the broad category of axonometric projection, is actually just a type of axonometric projection. And all that means, all axonometric projection is a way of displaying visuals on a screen that are kind of skewed. It's not just a straight-on, two-dimensional kind of view. It might be a little bit of an angle kind of thing. And when you do that angle, when you skew those graphics, the graphics then expose sides of images that would otherwise be unseen. Think about looking at a scene from a two-dimensional side-scrolling perspective. Well, if you skew the image kind of angled up, you're going to start to see maybe the tops of some bricks or the sides of some bricks that would otherwise be obscured by simply looking at the side dimensional 2D kind of view. That's all axonometric projection is. It's using some math and some angles to calculate a skewed version of graphics that creates a pseudo three-dimensional view of a given scene. Interestingly, the concept of axonometric projection is not really talked about more broadly from a video game perspective. Like I mentioned before, most times when people think about this kind of skewed imagery, people are talking about isometric projection, which is the term that has come to be colloquially covering all of these kind of projected kind of scenes. Think about games like Diablo or Fallout or Crusader. Any of those kind of games where the graphics are kind of angled, kind of skewed, kind of sort of 3D, but not truly 3D. Those have all been labeled isometric. In reality, they may not actually truly be isometric because the terms behind each of the different types of axonometric projection are actually related to the degree to which the image is skewed and the kinds of angles and the differences between the different axes, whether the X, Y, or Z axis. It's really talking about what kind of axes or which axes are shortened versus lengthened. So basically it's how is the image skewed? That determines what type of axonometric projection there is, whether that's isometric, dimetric, trimetric. All three of those, by the way, have been used in video games before, but I can almost guarantee you don't look at that latest angled title and say, oh, look at that dimetric game. No, most likely you're looking at it and you're saying, oh, look, another isometric game. That sounds kind of cool. Even some games that look that style are not even axonometric projections at all. They might be oblique projections, which use all different kinds of math to create different perspectives to create that pseudo 3D kind of environment. Now, I know that that discussion was a bit technical, and the fact is you don't need to worry about these kinds of distinctions most of the time, but I did want to share this concept anyway, simply because I found the whole deep dive into graphical projection techniques to be a bit interesting to myself, but also because the term axonometric projection would be the genesis behind the title of the game that Ikegami Tsushinki was working on. If they were going to use axonometric projection to create Sega's answer to Scramble, they might as well embed that graphical technique into the game itself. And it turns out that slapping a Z at the front of axonometric, adding an X, and then shortening the word to simply read Zaxxon sounds pretty darn cool, despite the fact that its origin is a form of orthogonal mathematical projection, not some sort of high-tech gadget or concept. Anyway, Zaxxon would be created to use a skewed perspective, allowing the game to appear to be 3D, with players able to control the height of their spacecraft in addition to where on the screen their craft could navigate, which would add a brand new element to gameplay beyond just shooting enemies. Players would have to be aware of their height, both for attacking and avoiding enemies, as well as for avoiding various walls and obstacles that could potentially ruin your day. Combine that gameplay with a resource management mechanic where you have to maintain your supply of fuel by shooting fuel barrels throughout each stage, and you have what Sega and Ikegami Tsushinki both hoped would be a recipe for success. Zaxxon would release in arcades in late 1981, and would interestingly just barely miss being the first actual released axonometric game ever made, a distinction that would instead go to Data East's Treasure Island in September of that year. Regardless of not quite being the first axonometric video game in history, though, it would become the most successful axonometric game in history, at least in the early 80s, as Zaxxon would be critically acclaimed and commercially successful, en route to winning numerous video game industry awards in 1982, as it was bolstered by a massive advertising campaign in North America that would result in the first commercial for an arcade game ever being played on television, with an advertising campaign of almost $1 million in total. This kind of pop culture advertising for a video game had never been done before. It turns out that level of advertising was totally warranted, as even today, the Zaxxon arcade release is widely considered to be one of the best arcade games of all time. Definitely a big deal in video game history. As often happened back around this time in arcade game history, if you had a big hit, you could almost be guaranteed that home ports would follow, despite the fact that arcade machines were dramatically more capable than their home counterparts. Despite those limitations, various companies would continue to port popular arcade games into the home, and that is exactly why, in the years following Zaxxon's arcade release, a number of home console versions of the title would make their way to various platforms across the entire industry. Now, we need to talk a little bit about the home ports for Zaxxon, because you can kind of think of them in one of several different categories. In one category, you had the versions of Zaxxon that truly did attempt to recreate the axonometric projection viewpoint that the arcade game utilized. The issue with that, though, with many of these earlier games, is that even if a console or a platform was able to simulate or emulate the way that this axonometric projection gameplay would play on an arcade game or an arcade cabinet, the hardware on those platforms just oftentimes were not powerful enough to really provide the same level of gameplay, speed, or even just general quality as what you would see on the arcade or in the arcades. You had another camp of Zaxxon titles where they kind of took inspiration from Zaxxon, but because the individual consoles themselves weren't powerful enough to do axonometric math, you didn't really have an axonometric projection game, which means the whole reason that Zaxxon was called Zaxxon failed to exist in those home ports. Obviously, not every port was equal, as the capabilities for each system and platform were different. And recall that using axonometric pseudo-3D styled visuals in a game was still a rarity in this era of gaming. Zaxxon was one of the firsts, and it was in the arcade, so trying to bring that into the home was going to be a challenge regardless of what home platform or console you were trying to work on. That is exactly what would happen with the Atari 2600 version of Zaxxon, which for all intents and purposes redefined a good portion of the game in order to work on Atari's venerable, albeit underpowered console. The concept of axonometric projection for that particular version of the game went totally out the window because the 2600 simply couldn't support it. And as the port's development studio Coleco began to strategize about how to bring Zaxxon home to the Atari 2600, they decided that they would focus on a different style of 3D-ish graphics that the Atari surprisingly could support. Which is why, as Zaxxon made its way to the Atari 2600, it lost the original's axonometric projection and instead presented a behind-the-ship pseudo-3D styled gameplay experience, where players would be flying into the screen, still with the ability to adjust their altitude to both avoid and attack enemies, and traverse a number of wall-based obstacles, all in the hopes of surviving to complete another run of the game. This, it turns out, would be a necessary concession, as the Atari 2600 could actually support this simulated behind-the-ship 3D viewpoint, with the only question being, would this version of Zaxxon resonate with gamers the same way that Sega's arcade original took the gaming world by storm? Well, the answer to that question was a bit mixed. When Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 came out in 1983, it was met with conflicting emotions. On one hand, seeing 3D-oriented gameplay on an Atari 2600, regardless of the perspective, was mind-meltingly insane. Remember, this was a system that once used a literal square to represent a heroic knight in shining armor. With Zaxxon, you were piloting a spaceship in what appeared to be a three-dimensional space, almost like a super rudimentary version of a Death Star trench run in Star Wars. Seeing the Atari 2600 pump out this style of visuals was insane for gamers of the time. At the same time, though, for many individuals who had experienced Zaxxon in the arcade, the Atari 2600 version of Zaxxon just wasn't Zaxxon. This, it turns out, would leave a bad taste in many Zaxxon players' mouths, not because Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 was a bad game. No, because calling it Zaxxon in the first place felt like a disingenuous cash grab, especially considering how far it had shifted from the original version of the title. If you're like me, you might be wondering what home console version of the time might actually be the closest analog to the arcade Zaxxon experience, because obviously the arcade version was very different than many home ports, but there were some home ports that attempted to do that whole axonometric projection kind of thing. The Atari 2600 could not. But which home console could? Which home console or platform could provide the best arcade-like Zaxxon experience? Well, for many, the answer to that question was, interestingly, the ColecoVision. Now, the observant amongst you might have noticed that the ColecoVision was created by parent company Coleco, which was the same company who would release the non-axonometric version of Zaxxon for the Atari 2600, as well as another non-axonometric version of the game for the Intellivision. I don't want to go all conspiracy theory here, but I do wonder whether it would have been advantageous for Coleco to release subpar ports of Zaxxon for different consoles, thereby allowing their own console to remain the best home playable version of the game. I have seen this concept suggested by others on the internet, and while I have no direct proof, it's certainly an idea that could potentially have some merit. Regardless, Zaxxon would be followed up in the arcades by Super Zaxxon, which attempted to mimic the success of the original, but unfortunately wouldn't reach such heights. Being one of the first axonometric projection games in history, it stands to reason that Zaxxon would inspire other offshoots and copycat titles as well, though for the most part, none would touch the original game's overall design and gameplay experience. Zaxxon would continue to be ported and re-released over the years, while also being included in several game compilations, and being reimagined on more modern gaming platforms, with the latest new release being Zaxxon Escape for iOS and Android mobile devices in 2012. Like most derivatives and spin-offs of Zaxxon, these newer titles do not resemble the arcade original to any great degree, short of carrying the same name. Which means, in the eyes of many, if you want to get a true Zaxxon experience, the arcade original is the place to get it. That being said, that is not the version of the game we're covering here. Instead, we're going to look at the Atari 2600 version as we attempt to answer the question: is Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 still a worthwhile experience today? Or is it simply a throwaway title intended to profit off of a true arcade classic's name recognition? We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Zaxxon for the Atari 2600 today versus when it was released all the way back in 1983. Generally speaking, Zaxxon is a space combat flight simulator, which at a glance might sound like any number of other games that you may have played over the years. It is literally one of the most generic descriptions of a game that you could probably give to anything that exists in space and has some degree of combat. But Zaxxon is actually different than nearly any other space flight game released on a home console in the early 80s, for a couple of different reasons. First, Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 presents a behind-the-ship, three-dimensional perspective to gameplay, which was not the norm in the early 80s, which was well before the era of three-dimensional graphics in games. And secondly, Zaxxon, in all of its pseudo-3D glory, is running on the Atari 2600, a system that, quite frankly, is not known for its processing horsepower. Like we talked about earlier, the Atari is not a graphical powerhouse. To think that the Atari was capable of anything resembling three-dimensional gameplay or visuals around the early 80s would certainly not be something that most people would think about. Most Atari games were either original games that represented arcade-like kinds of experiences, or were ports of popular and fairly repetitive arcade games that actually existed in arcades around the world. There wasn't a ton on the Atari 2600 that would be considered super deep. There were certain games that bucked that trend, like the variety of screens prevalent in Pitfall, which presented a huge world to explore, or the somewhat open-world gameplay of Adventure. But most of the time, Atari 2600 games consisted of a few screens worth of gameplay, many of which were single-screen affairs, not really having a ton of scrolling, and were effectively mimics of many of the arcade games that existed at the time as well. Zaxxon is an entirely different beast, because unlike those fairly static kinds of games we were just talking about, and similar, at least conceptually, to Zaxxon in the arcades, Zaxxon presents a world that you can navigate through, and in this world, you are navigating through it in what appears to be 3 dimensions. You truly do. When you play Zaxxon on the Atari 2600, you have a 3-dimensional perspective and view into the game world. You are, as you control your ship, flying into the screen. That's a very interesting flip on the traditional gameplay mechanics that you would see in many Atari 2600 titles. And yes, as video games continue to evolve, you would see this style of gameplay become more prevalent. Even on other 8-bit consoles like the NES or the Sega Master System, you would see some games that would utilize a similar kind of style. But Zaxxon wasn't on those systems, it was on the Atari 2600. Now, switching the gameplay over to a more 3D kind of perspective does in fact change the way you have to think about playing the game, because avoiding obstacles here is not just a simple matter of navigating your ship up or down and avoiding something from hitting you directly. You have to actually deal with your overall perspective. As you're flying into the screen, you're going to be tasked with managing your overall height and altitude as you're moving through the various environments. You do have an altitude meter, which shows you how high or low your ship is in comparison to the ground on the space station or wherever you're flying. So you do see an altimeter that allows you to see what your overall altitude is. But more useful is the fact that your ship and other objects can actually cast shadows on the environment. That's going to become a big deal as you play the game, because understanding how high you are in the game, what your overall altitude is going to be a major component of whether you're successful or you fail playing the game. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Enemies follow the same kind of mechanics, where enemies can rise up or go down, and they can move all around. Some of the enemies will shoot at you, some of them will not. They'll just be obstacles that try to go right into your path and make you ruin your day, effectively, because you don't want to hit them, otherwise you will die. Adding an additional complexity to the overall gameplay loop is the fact that you have to manage your overall fuel. As you fly around, as you navigate different obstacles and you move around different walls or you shoot enemies, your fuel source is constantly depleting, which means you need to continually replenish that fuel in order to continue playing the game. There are these little cylinders, these fuel cells that appear throughout the game that you have to navigate to shoot, and if you shoot them, you will gain some additional fuel that will then replenish your fuel meter and allow you to fly a little bit longer until you have to replenish the fuel again. This is a fairly constant kind of mechanic, by the way, so the whole gameplay loop consists of navigating your ship, avoiding obstacles, shooting, defeating, and sometimes avoiding enemies, and then replenishing your fuel. That is the core gameplay loop for Zaxxon. And it's very traditional. It's a very traditional kind of loop that you would see in any kind of arcade game because it's highly repetitive. You do it once, you can do it again, and maybe the challenge will increase as you play the game or the speed will increase, but otherwise it's a fairly traditional gameplay loop. I do also want to mention, because like most arcade games, Zaxxon does work off of a high score system. And generally speaking, the reason you would play a game like Zaxxon multiple times is to try to continue to get a higher and higher score. This is not about trying to complete a ton of missions or feel a story or experience a story. It's not about that. It's really just about how do you improve your skills to get as high of a score as possible. The gameplay mechanics we just talked about are then used as you continue to play through the game. And when you play Zaxxon, you'll actually end up playing through several different scenes, defeating and avoiding enemies, and finally going toe-to-toe against a massive robotic boss with a missile, before you get to do the whole thing over again at yet another higher difficulty level, which is very similar to the way most arcade-oriented titles of the time would be designed, with never-ending gameplay, albeit with increasing levels of difficulty. So let's talk briefly about the 3 segments of every single run of Zaxxon. So this is the same for every single difficulty setting. You will go through several different areas as you progress through what I would call a quote-unquote run of Zaxxon. You start in a space station. You're going to have some fairly traditional enemies, some of which will change their altitude to try to intercept you and shoot at you. You're going to have a bunch of walls with gaps that you're going to have to progress through. That's where the altitude adjustment really comes into play. Well, actually, it comes into play in 2 areas. One is with enemies, because there are some enemies that are really easy to defeat. Some enemies are going to just wreck you, and it really is necessary to understand what heights, what altitudes those enemies will try to attack and intercept you at, because sometimes you may not even want to try to shoot them to get some points. You may just want to avoid them. Like if you know an enemy is going to be one of those enemies that flies high on the screen, and it's a difficult enemy or they move erratically or randomly, you may want to position your ship lower in terms of height so that you just simply avoid them and they can't shoot you. If there's an easier enemy, you might want to intercept them and shoot them and get some points. But there are a fair variety of enemies in the game, and there are a couple in particular that I do not like. And some of those I just actively avoid rather than going for them. And you need to really understand what the altitude is, what the overall height is for those enemies in order to either avoid them or shoot them before they can shoot you. As you're moving through these walls, though, I mentioned walls with gaps. This is perhaps one of the trickiest areas of the game to get a feel for, because as you're navigating the world, there will be different areas and different sections of walls where you might see a little gap, and the gap is situated at a particular height. And you have to determine exactly what height you need to be in order to pass through that wall without hitting the wall, because if you hit the wall, you're going to die. I will give you a little bit of a strategy around how to do that in just a couple minutes. But suffice it to say, altitude management in Zaxxon for the Atari 2600 is incredibly, incredibly important. Now let's say you get past the space station sequence. The very next sequence is a space fight sequence where you're literally in the vacuum of space fighting against a series of different enemy spacecraft. There's really no height changing here for you. It's pretty straightforward, though the enemies can move in fairly random patterns. So this is an area where it's not a slam dunk kind of experience. You will experience some challenge here, especially on later difficulty settings, but it's really not all that difficult to move through because you don't have to worry about navigating through gaps in walls. You just have to worry about avoiding or defeating enemies. And then finally, after that space fight sequence, you get to a final space station run. This time, though, it's a bit more difficult than your first space station encounter because you have more enemies and more walls to get through. And as you progress onto higher difficulty levels, there are additional electronic force fields that will present even smaller gaps in each wall that you have to progress through, making managing your height even more specifically challenging. Because I can't stress enough that Zaxxon on the 2600 is all about managing your height. Yes, you have to manage your fuel, you have to attack your enemies and all that kind of stuff. But in order to survive, you need to adjust your height as quickly as possible. You need to get to the right gaps in the wall as quickly as possible, and you've got to combine that with all of the enemies that you have to face. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is a strategy for figuring out if you're at the right altitude in order to progress past a barrier. And this becomes really important during these final space station runs, where with an electronic force field above you and a bunch of wall below you, there's going to be a little sliver that you can pass through without actually taking damage or without actually dying. Well, the way to do that, especially as you're getting used to what each of the different altitudes looks like and what your shadow looks like at different heights, because you can use your shadow to judge your overall height, which is actually a cool feature where the ship's height corresponds to the level of shadow that you're projecting onto the floor. But as you get used to all of these height mechanics, there's going to be times where you're just not going to know if you're at the right position to pass through one of these barriers. Well, the way to do that is simply fire ahead of you. If your missile hits something, meaning if you fire your gun and it hits the wall or it hits a barrier or some way, it will not pass through it. That means that you are not at the right height to avoid death. If your missile does pass through that individual barrier, then that means you're at the right height. You want to maintain that height as you go through that wall, and then you can do whatever other adjustments you need to once you get beyond that wall. This is something that is very useful to use, and when you're starting to get used to the game, is going to become very, very important to really leverage. As you get used to the game, though, and as you become more proficient, you will start to understand what heights correspond to which barriers, and you're going to be able to navigate these environments much more easily without having to fire your missile. That being said, I think I, most of the time, just keep firing my missile because I don't want to chance it. Even when I got fairly proficient at judging my altitude, judging my height, and moving past obstacles, I still liked the little warm fuzzy feeling I got by shooting my gun and seeing, oh yeah, it actually passed through there, so I don't have to worry about potentially dying. Anyway, once you get past that final space station run, you will finally go into a fight with the boss of the stage, where you need to shoot a missile that's attached to a big robot multiple times before it fires at you. This sequence is very straightforward once you figure out the right height to orient your spacecraft, and it doesn't appear to change. That height doesn't appear to change regardless of your difficulty or how many playthroughs you may be on. The number of times you need to hit the boss does change with each successive difficulty, but the actual orientation and height to effectively hit the boss, that doesn't change at all. So if you've beaten the boss once, you pretty much know how to beat him every single time you get to him. There's very little danger here unless you have some issue with getting to the right height and then orienting your ship so that you can keep hitting that missile. Because if you can't, the missile will eventually fire at you, and if it fires at you and hits you, you will die. So that's kind of the core concept behind the boss fight. And that sequence, the original space station flight, the space fight sequence, the final space station run, and the fight against the boss, that represents a run of Zaxxon. That is, for all intents and purposes, you have just beaten a run of Zaxxon, which means in typical arcade fashion, the game doesn't stop, it just sends you into your next playthrough, which is the same exact set of stages that you just progressed through, albeit with quicker gameplay and in some instances more advanced obstacles. Like I was mentioning, those electronic force fields, they start showing up in the later difficulty levels. In the original difficulty or the base difficulty, they are not there, which is a godsend because once they start showing up, it gets a little bit more tricky, especially considering the speed that the game can play through. Let's talk about difficulty actually a little bit. This is probably a good time to talk about it. There are 4 different difficulty levels. If you start on a lower difficulty level and beat the boss, the very next playthrough, like we were just talking about, you'll be at the following difficulty level. From my perspective, and I have played them all, level 1 and 2, so difficulty levels 1 and 2 really aren't bad at all. The speed is relatively slow. It's a good way to acclimate to the overall game. You have plenty of time to judge your altitude and height and how you're moving through the different obstacles. Plenty of time to line up and fire your gun a few times. And if it doesn't pass through the wall that you're about to hit, you have plenty of time to react. Level 3 is a pretty good challenge. This is where the speed of the game starts to really ramp up. The enemies start to become a little bit more aggressive. It becomes a little bit trickier to be able to orient your ship and actually survive in any playthrough. And then level 4 requires a ton of practice. Level 4 is really, really difficult, especially if you're like me and think to yourself, level 1 is nothing. I might as well just bump it up to the max difficulty. Oh, that was a mistake. But I will tell you, after beating level 4, it made the earlier difficulty levels dramatically easier. I mean, level 1 looked like it was slow motion after I beat level 4. So I can't say that I truly recommend starting on the higher difficulty levels, but I will say that the higher difficulty levels, once you get used to them, make the earlier difficulty levels much more easy. Now, as an endless arcade kind of experience, I had to kind of figure out what victory meant to me, because as you all know, when I play these games, I play them until I quote unquote beat them. That's how I determine my opinion of the game. That's how I figure out where they sit in our overall ranking of classic gaming. But with a game like Zaxxon, or really any arcade game that's endless, I had to figure out what victory is. What can I say? What is the line in the sand that lets me say, I beat this game? So for me, and these are totally arbitrary distinctions, but for me, that meant that I had to beat each difficulty mode for at least one playthrough, and I also needed to have at least one total run with a high score of 50,000 points in a single playthrough. I thought that would be not too bad to get to. I thought it would take a couple hours of practice to get good enough to be able to get 50,000 points in a single playthrough. I underestimated. I don't have the exact amount of time I played. I played many hours. I underestimated the amount of time it would take to get 50,000 points in a single playthrough. I thought it was going to be not too bad. Turns out 50,000 points is a pretty good playthrough of Zaxxon for the Atari 2600. I didn't realize I was going to test myself quite as much as I did. I will say, it holds up. It holds up for 50,000 points, but boy, there were some runs where I got so close and then ended up failing because, like I was saying, as you go through the difficulty levels, it continues to get harder and harder. I don't know if beyond level 4 actually gets harder or if it's just a repeat of the level 4 difficulty. I'm not entirely sure on that, but what I will say is that getting to around 49,000 points and then accidentally whacking yourself into a wall is not the most fun experience. There's another thing here too, because one of the mechanics in the game is that if you get to 10,000 points, you will get an extra life. So I thought that meant that every time you got 10,000 points, you would get an extra life, which to me, I was thinking, okay, we're getting to 10,000 is not that bad. It shouldn't be too hard to accumulate a ton of extra lives, which should make getting to 50,000 points pretty easy. Only, nope, I was wrong. You only get an extra life at 10,000 points. After that, you're entirely on your own. You do not get any extra lives as you play the game, unless there's some weird additional extra life somewhere with a huge, ridiculous score, in which case, I'm just not sure. But from what I played, you only get a single extra life at 10,000 points. You do, however, get 5 lives when you begin playing the game. And with getting to 10,000 points, you'll get an extra solitary extra life, which is beneficial. But just like most arcade games at the time, if you lose all of those lives, it's game over, and you have to restart the game. I would say from a difficulty perspective, overall, the game is fairly balanced, though the later difficulty levels get really fast and require some game knowledge to be successful, like what heights to attack certain enemies at and how to quickly orient your ship based on the gaps available in a given wall, which, like I said, does get easier the more you play the game. At first, especially on the harder difficulties, you may think that the game is impossible. It's not. You just need a little bit of practice. Let's talk a little bit about gameplay for the game, because Zaxxon is one of those games that is pretty darn simple. It has common flight sim kinds of controls, where you press up on your joystick to descend, down to ascend, and then left or right to move left and right respectively. Overall, that control scheme feels very traditional and snappy. You can also shoot using your controller's button, which is necessary to dispatch enemies, as well as to recover fuel in the middle of a level by shooting some of those fuel containers and replenishing your fuel. Now, you might think the overall strategy here is to defeat as many enemies as possible, which, if you're going for a high score, is certainly true. But if you're simply trying to survive, that might not be the best approach. We've been talking about how difficult it is, especially in the early going, to judge your height, to judge how high you need to be to avoid different obstacles with the walls and the enemies as they move towards you or away from you or try to shoot at you. This is a very challenging game to wrap your head around and understand all of the mechanics in a way that becomes natural. You can play the game, you can pick it up and play it, and it's not going to be any issue. To get good though, and to actually be able to progress through the game, you're going to have to develop some pretty strong muscle memory. And part of that memory is understanding where different enemies attack from, what their movement patterns are, and what heights they typically come at you at. Because there are some enemies that move so erratically and so randomly that you will get hit from somewhere and not even understand how the heck you got hit. There are a couple in particular that have really haphazard patterns that might throw you off. So for me, the best way to simply survive the game was to simply skim the surface of the space station, only ascending as necessary based on the gaps in the various walls and force fields. That lets you avoid the trickiest enemies, all of whom will generally ascend above you and effectively not pose any danger to you while you're closer to the ground. This isn't a foolproof plan though, and especially on higher difficulties, there are plenty of tricky moments regardless of how you end up attempting to play the game. At the end of the day, the mix of fuel replenishment, enemy combat, and ship maneuvering that makes up Zaxxon's core gameplay loop is engaging. And even though sometimes you might be playing to survive rather than get a high score, regardless of how you're playing the game, it's a pretty addicting gameplay loop. As with nearly all quality arcade-style experiences, the gameplay loop just screams for one more run. Though admittedly, the Atari 2600 version of Zaxxon doesn't quite hit pure arcade nirvana, for a couple of different reasons that we'll begin discussing in just a little bit. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have gameplay videos we could look up. Back then, most of our buying decisions were made off of word of mouth from family and friends, what the magazines might have said about games, what reviews we might have read, and what the box actually looked like sitting in the game store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Zaxxon, for the Atari 2600, the back of the box says Zaxxon by Sega. Here's how to play. This fantastic three-dimensional space battle game puts you in control of a futuristic spaceship. Your ship zooms over an alien asteroid and dives down to attack the enemy's installations. Your ship must avoid hazardous walls, enemy fire, and other unforeseen dangers. Can you survive and score? And then there is a graphic, not a screenshot, but a graphic showing your ship passing or getting close to a wall with a gap on it. Interestingly, that graphic shows an axonometric projection view of that ship moving near that wall, which you would have seen in the Zaxxon arcade game, but is not a feature of Zaxxon for the Atari 2600. So that is the back of the box for Zaxxon, and I have got to say, I don't know. This era of gaming was much more quaint, much more simple than what we would see in later years. Does this box sell me on it without having particular nostalgia for the game? Nah, not really. I do have a bone to pick with Sega and Coleco showing an axonometric projection view of the graphic and not having axonometric projection in the game. That's kind of a little bit of an oddity because it's not like they showed a screenshot to show what the game actually looked like. So you might come home and assume you're about to play Zaxxon the same way it looked in the arcades, only to discover that it does not. It does not look or play the same way. So a little bit of a bait and switch maybe there a little bit. Overall, the back of the box doesn't really sell me. It's way too bare, way too simple. I recognize that this era of gaming was just like that for the most part, but at the same time, this one just simply doesn't sell me on the title. We're going to move on and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game now, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. For the graphics, we need to tackle this concept from a couple different perspectives. First, this is an Atari 2600 title, which means the overall graphical quality is going to be limited. We've talked about that several times before. There is a super small color palette. There's limited detail in ships and enemies. The environments are effectively flat shaded walls or simply the blackness of space. Generally speaking, that's pretty much par for the course for an Atari 2600 title. But these rudimentary graphics are presented using a pseudo 3D kind of perspective, which on the Atari 2600 is simply mind-blowing. Now, I know that this was effectively a graphics trick, but for a system where your main character might actually be a square, literally, seeing a 3D-ish kind of experience and one that runs pretty darn smoothly on an Atari 2600 is nothing short of insane. That said, is it a good-looking game? Well, no, not really. But it is certainly a technically impressive game for an Atari 2600 title. It is smooth, animations are nice, graphics fairly rudimentary, but overall, not bad for an Atari 2600 game. Moving on to the sound and music, There is none. You do have some sound effects, like for changing your ship's altitude adjustments and combat, all of which sound fine for an Atari 2600 title, but otherwise, this is about as bare bones of an auditory environment as you're going to get. Once again, kinda par for the course for an Atari 2600 era game. Moving on to the story, there isn't any. You're a space combat pilot, and you have to defeat an alien menace while surviving waves of enemies and obstacles, and that's pretty much it. Not only was this a port of an actual arcade title like we've been talking about, but it's also a game from 1983, which means a story was almost certainly not going to be in the cards here. That's not a bad thing given the style of game that we're talking about, as an arcade vertically scrolling shooter doesn't need a story to be successful, so this isn't something I minded at all. But it is something to note, just in case you were thinking you were going to get some sort of world-class narrative in an arcade-styled Atari 2600 title, the simple fact is, you will not. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked about the controls, which are simple, but effective and pretty snappy. And we also talked about the general structure of the game, which is fairly simple, but similarly effective. What we haven't talked about yet, though, are some of the things that keep the game from being an all-time great Atari 2600 title. The first is that the 3D perspective in the game is super cool, and I loved the fact that the Atari 2600 had a 3D styled game actually running on its hardware. But the 3D gameplay is super finicky to get used to, and even with all of the different mechanics that the game gives you for managing your overall perspective, like the shadows for the height, being able to shoot through walls to determine how high you are, and just your overall skill as you play the game, it is nearly impossible to tell what height an enemy ship is attacking from, especially because they change their heights somewhat randomly sometimes. And it is still really difficult to orient your ship to pass through different wall gaps, especially at higher difficulty levels where the speed makes it so that the normal strategy of shooting to see if your projectiles pass through the wall is more challenging to pull off. There's just not enough time to orient your ship effectively at the higher difficulty levels until you develop the muscle memory needed to make such a movement trivial. The game, though, can also be occasionally buggy, which is a big irritation of mine. Sometimes I literally exploded without being near an enemy or an enemy missile, and let me tell you, it is super frustrating when you're trying to string together a good enough run to get a relatively high score in the game to simply explode just because. I also have to talk about the fuel depletion mechanic in the game, which by itself is fine. The issue, though, is that fuel continues to deplete in between the different areas of a run, even when you don't have control over your ship. As you're moving from one part of your run, whether that's the original space station to the space fight combat to the final space station to the boss, and then overall going back to redo that whole thing, as you're transitioning between those different substages, you don't have control over your ship, and there's nothing you can do, but your fuel continues to deplete. So let's say you just beat the boss of a given run, but you ended the fight with limited fuel. Well, that fuel is going to continue to deplete while the game sends you to your next playthrough, which means you may in fact die due to losing all of your fuel without you being able to do anything about it, which honestly just sucks. Admittedly, all of those aren't huge complaints, but they are irritants that serve to detract from the overall enjoyment of playing the game, especially if you're trying to go for a high score. If you're just playing the game for quote-unquote fun, though, these complaints are much less of an issue, because the act of playing the game is, luckily, really, really fun. So, what is our verdict on Zaxxon for the Atari 2600? Well, it's very clear that Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 is not the same as the arcade Zaxxon experience. The question is, though, does it do enough given the limitations of the Atari 2600 to warrant your attention today? The answer to that question is a little bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, it's amazing that this exists on the Atari 2600 at all, and despite the fact that the pseudo 3D included in the game isn't real 3D, it is still a technical marvel given the Atari 2600's lack of processing power. That said, I do have to question whether this was just a bit too much of a stretch for the Atari 2600. To be clear, I did enjoy playing the game, and I appreciated the gameplay and structure of the game for what it was. At the same time, there were some nagging issues and inconsistencies that made the game feel less polished than it probably could have been. I'm not upset that the Atari version of Zaxxon deviated so far from the quote-unquote official arcade release. I'm just a little disappointed that the experience we did get on the Atari 2600 didn't quite reach the level of other limited experience, albeit expertly designed Atari 2600 games that danced around the limitations of the console, as opposed to trying to surmount them, somewhat unsuccessfully. Despite that critique though, I still believe there is goodness here, and as a demonstration of an experience that should not exist on the Atari 2600, this is one that you should try at some point in your gaming career. Which is why, for me, Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 is deserving of its spot on our list of golden oldies. It certainly has some limitations, and it's not the smoothest or most well-designed Atari 2600 title out there. What it is, though, is a really interesting attempt at making the Atari 2600 do something it was never intended to do, and I can only imagine what people playing it back when it first came out thought of the game. It had to have been akin to technical wizardry. That wizardry, while still impressive, isn't quite as impactful today, which is why Zaxxon has ultimately become the newest member in our collection of golden oldies. It is now time for our weekly challenges. These are, of course, focused on Zaxxon. So, tackle these challenges, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord, and you can win some coins. The first challenge is to simply score 10,000 points. I had mentioned that 10,000 points is the threshold beyond which you will get a singular extra life. So if you can hit 10,000 points in your playthrough, you will earn 1 coin. The second challenge is to reach and defeat a boss. You can do that on any difficulty level you want. If you do get up to the boss of a run-through and you beat him, you will get 2 coins. And then finally, the third challenge is to complete a single run starting on difficulty level 4. That means progress through the space combat portion, progress through the initial space station portion, the final space station portion, and defeat the boss while starting on difficulty level 4. If you can defeat that challenge and complete it, you will earn 3 coins. As always, like I mentioned, please post proof of your accomplishments out over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Zaxxon. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on our Sounds of the Classics. This is a new Sounds of the Classics episode. This one is going to be focused on the music of Final Fantasy X. So definitely write in if you have any particularly fond memories about that. Get your comments featured on the show. But otherwise, this is going to be another episode where we're going to do a little bit of a joint kind of discussion about Final Fantasy X, continuing the discussion from episode 153-ish, whatever it was. So looking forward to that one. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Sounds of the Classics, Final Fantasy X. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.